Is there anything unique about working with, managing, or being an open source developer? That's what we're going to find out on this episode of Dynamic Developer. I'm your host, Bill Detwiler, and on this episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Todd Moore, Vice President for Open Technology and Developer Advocacy at IBM. Todd has a long history in software and hardware development and is a leader in the open source world. He and his team of developers have worked with leading open source communities like the Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation, Eclipse, OpenStack. The list goes on and on. So, Todd, thanks for joining us.
Well, excellent. And I'm happy to be here. I really appreciate it. This is, the topics of developers are really near and dear to my heart, especially when they're working on something that's in open source. I put a lot of my time out into open source communities like the OpenJS Foundation and Node.js and other topics, and in the cloud native space, Cloud Native Computing Foundation, things like that. So it's something that I view as part of my give back into the community. So
well, let's start there. As someone that's managed development teams and been part of the developer community, and is now focusing really around open source and developer and development and the open source community, what's changed in maybe the last couple decades in terms of just developer career tracks and managing development teams and some of the challenges that both developers and managers face? I think that's kind of a really interesting place to start, especially someone like yourself that has, a long experience in this space.
I think the first thing that changed was open source really took a dominant position in the development process. And what we find is that, a large percentage, 50% of organizations are now using open source in a fairly substantial way. And sometimes as much as 90% of a product that someone's putting out is based on open source, right? They've done the customizations and the other things around it to produce something unique, but open source is its core. So what's happened with that is when you're looking for people who are participants in your development process, you also want them to be participants in the open source communities as well, too, to have good acumen, to have the ability to influence direction, but also to make the changes necessary to keep things rolling in case you might have a problem or one of your customers might have a problem. So it's really become paramount that you look for skills that also have good development in open source skills. And they're kind of different people sometimes than the classical developer who's out building something just for a product that's proprietary, right? The proprietary products, the developers can create large chunks of code and immediately put them into the CI stream and build a product. But when you're out working in a community, that kind of behavior doesn't really work well. Right? You need small, manageable chunks of code that people can review in a setting and one sitting, I should say, and then be able to relate to and decide that yes, +1 that can be included, and let's go get it into the build, right, into the tree. So it's a different kind of approach, and people need some different skills. I guess the thing that when we look at somebody who's coming in, we look at what they're doing in GitHub first, right? Is their behavior one that supports community? Example would be, do they just jump into the fray, or are they listening? Have they built up some rapport with the community? Do they understand how the community likes to structure their code and behave? Do they do code reviews? Have they been a mentor? Did they seek a mentor to help them get going in the work that they're doing, right? Because you have to develop others in the community too. You're doing this because you want that project to have a long-term life and be well supported, because you're going to be dependent on it. You're building your product on it, right? So you want to make sure that your folks are good community builders that build trust, they create good, clean, manageable code. And you can find that just by looking at GitHub these days, right? So your resume as a coder, as a developer is GitHub, right? So important to really take that really seriously, right? One of the other things that we've seen is that, we like to see people who don't just drop code and run, but are in there and make sure that if there's a piece of code, especially if there's a lot of dependency on it, that they help others either through maintaining it and continuing to have a maintenance plan, or they gracefully hand it off to somebody else as they go through the process. So those are the things I look for when I'm looking at somebody's coding, and their participation. It's, how do they handle issues? What do they do?
Yeah, and that's what I was just going to ask. I was really going to try and drill down on, you talk about technical skills, but what I hear you describing is more of, I don't know, when I was in IT full time 20 years ago, we would call it soft skills, right? It were those people skills or communication skills. The ability to work and play well with others, the ability to sort of reach out beyond that individual project that they're working on or their part of the project. How important are those skills? I mean, it sounds like they're very important from what you're describing. How do you identify those skills beyond maybe what you just kind of talked about in either as part of an interview process or as part of, is looking at GitHub and, talking to others or seeing what they've done, is that enough, like you were talking about? Or, are there other ways that people who are hiring developers, people who are looking for talent, and developers themselves who are looking to showcase those skills, how do you find that person with the right skill set?
And I think this is, it's a great topic, and you're right on, because it's the soft skills that make for better open source developers, right? And we've seen that time and time again, that we can't necessarily just take someone who was a very good, productive developer in our, product side of the house and turn them loose in open source because of this soft skill. And so, the GitHub set of things gives you sort of the first look into them, right? You can see how they behave, the types of language they use. Are they, really playing nice within the community? But then in that interview process that you have with them, you need to sort of ask those questions, right? What's your approach to joining a new community? And people who respond with, well, I feel my way in, I look for, a technical mentor to help me, and at the same time, I help them get their work done. Those types of responses tell you that this person knows how to behave in a community, right? That they're actively listening as much as they're contributing code, and they're doing it in a thoughtful way. And I learned so much about that just a long time ago from folks who were out and working in communities, that it was just so important to do that. And we've since written our own etiquette guide for our developers who are participating in open source, that codify those principles so that they're out there and they're taking that into account. And I look for those same things as we go through that interview process with a developer.
So talk a little bit about that. I'd love to hear more. What are some of the, you don't have to recite the entire kind of, the entire document, but what are some of the main points that you put into that code of ethics, or that you developed there at IBM around open source development?
Okay, well, there's 7 things in the etiquette guide. And I won't hit them all too hard, but understanding the community, the way they do things, not just jumping into the fray, but listening first, understanding the rules, looking for a code of conduct when you come into the community, making sure that that's there and you abide by it, right? Treat others the way you want to be treated. The golden rule kind of thing here really comes into play. People don't care about the degrees you have or what other things you've done or whatever. They want you to treat them well, right? And understand that. And if you do that, most communities will be very friendly back to you, and they'll hand you the keys to the kingdom if you're a committer, right, into a process. If you really are that respectful and helpful and know how to get involved, right? Start small, build trust. You can't just jump in with great big huge changes and expect people are going to go and embrace that. That's one that we often have to teach many times to people as we go through this. But because people get excited, they want to get something in there. Contribute good, clean, manageable, tested code that can be consumed within one sitting when you're trying to go and do a code review. Because remember, people on the other end of this are doing code reviews. And the other thing for etiquette is, if you got 5 IBM guys in a project and 10 other people, make sure it's the other people who are doing the reviews and saying it should be committed into the tree, as opposed to just the IBMers, as an example, right? You don't, I think it's really bad form to see people within a company also plus one somebody's contributions when, we really need to make sure it's the quality of the code and the type of function and feature that we want, as opposed to the other way around. So make sure you get your code maintained and keep it maintained. Be a mentor. Look for mentors as well too as you go about this. Find a mentor who is somebody who's prominent in the community and support them. And they'll help you in your path towards committer in a community. But more importantly, you'll be getting good, positive, important community work done, and that people respect that. And that's just part of giving back. And so give back is something that we ask people to do. And then lastly, licensing is important, right? There's permissive licenses and not so permissive licenses, and know what it is you're dealing with and where that code is going to be used in your own projects as you go back and support those who are back at, trying to build something on this, and make sure that you keep the interfaces clean and that you're practicing good hygiene around that as well too, so that you're very aware of and friendly to the license that is going on within the community that you're involved in.
Yeah, and as I'm listening to you describe this, it really sounds like, and I don't mean this in a negative way, it's a lot for a single person to kind of take into account, or at least it sounds like it is, as opposed to just sitting down and banging out code or sitting down and banging. I mean, there's a lot of extra, and I think in a good way. There's a lot of, a lot of kind of things to think about when you're doing this.
But there's a benefit to that. There's a benefit to that, right? Because, O'Reilly Media did a recent survey that, we helped to sponsor because we wanted to know what was going on. And they talked to more than 3,500 developers and managers. And what they found is that open source code was, just as, to those people developing, just as good as any other proprietary code that they were doing, that when they were looking to go and host and use this on a cloud, that 94% of them wanted to have open source software be, or I should say 70% of them wanted open source software to be the basis for what was going to be their cloud application, cloud native application they were developing. The managers, 65% of them preferred people who understood the base technologies, not some specific cloud kind of thing, but the basic technologies underneath this. And the developers realized that at least 65% of them did, that if they had good open source skills, they were going to be more marketable to the people who might want to employ them as they went. So it's in everybody's awareness, managers, developers, the businesses who are using this. So it's just part and part of where we are now.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I was going to ask you was what's and I love that transition because you mentioned managers, and I was going to ask, what is there anything different or unique about managing either open source developers or an open source project or people working on open source projects, managing within this community that's unique? And so, because I think that's the, with all this extra or just all these sort of extra considerations, it seems to me like that's not only going to be on the developer, but it's also on the managers themselves to really sort of help guide folks along with some of this etiquette.
Yeah, the manager needs to be involved. He needs to understand, where things are going. He's got to also realize that many of these developers have these qualities, also want to work on the things that are interesting to them. They have passion for the community. There might be something that the community is doing that doesn't quite support something that's back at the ranch, but that's okay. a good portion of the time that they spend in the community can be also developing things that are community important. I call it carrying water, chopping wood, and you just have to do those things for the community. So we make sure that when we're talking with the managers and giving them some training, that they understand that that community participation piece is a piece of this, and that it's not like managing a program and a project with really tight deadlines and the types of things you do. Communities move at their own pace. They have their own directions that they take. What you get out of that community is what you put into it. So if you need to see it move, you put resources in, you help them. You make sure it's good resources, obviously, that understand open source. But it's different. It's not that same kind of world. And hopefully they're following a process where their whole CI process is moving fairly quickly. That's a nice thing about open source. It generally does. And especially if they have the ability to have releases that are both a long-term stable kind of release, as well as the leading edge bleeding thing that everybody's contributing to try new features and functions and really try to move the ball forward. That allows you to have something that's dependable for the guys back home, but at the same time be able to have the fun things go on in there too, to test the boundaries of where you're going with a project. So managers have to understand that that's going on, and that good open source skills are very curious skills as well too, who want to participate in things.
I think that's also a great point to talk about. Community is a little different when conflict comes up or when disagreements may come up. Is there anything unique about sort of the open source community and the etiquette and the model you're kind of talking up when there are disagreements? Whether they're minor disagreements or whether they're more serious disagreements about code or licensing issues or just how a project to proceed. How do you approach those disagreements in a community setting?
Yeah, I had the honor of being on a front row seat to the Node.js community when it was going through its fork and then healing that fork back into a solid community. And it can be really tough because people get very personal very quickly when those things happen. And things can be typing something into a node or typing something into a message can be very imprecise, and people can take the wrong message back as a result of that. So when a community goes awry, my first thing is to try to get the main participants together. And I helped heal that fork. I was one of the people who gathered up the folks and said, hey, look, we're going to go work on this together, and let's figure out how to bring this back together again. And it started with getting the main folks back together and having them chat and talk and talking about what was important to them. I think the place where communities go awry is that there's oftentimes, when they're not out in open governance as part of a foundation, there have a steward who is somebody who's a company who's put that code out there. And there's a certain set of expectations, and things run around along just fine for a while. But then after a body of work is done, suddenly that steward may have other ideas of what they want to do. They might be off trying to promote the community or use it in a different way or whatever, and start to create friction within the team. And there may be changes that they want to make, but the steward no longer wants to make, right? Those are the places where the friction starts to come to life. And as a result of that, that's where you start to see forks, or really a discussion starts around going and placing the code into a foundation to support it as you move forward in the future. And we've seen that time and time again, that communities get to a certain point and then suddenly there's unrest among the community members and a press towards open governance because they don't want to be beholden to a single vendor, especially if it's something that's going to be a de facto standard. Code has become de facto standards now, right? Kubernetes is an example, right? Great de facto standard that's come about in the container space. Because it's hosted in a foundation supported by more companies than anything you can imagine, and has a great developer base who's done a great job of creating a culture and standing up something that now will endure the test of time, and it's a de facto standard of code. So I always recommend to folks who are working in communities or companies that I work with, if you've got something significant and you want it to become that de facto standard that people can depend on, because there are things that are generally plumbing that we all should just share in. Why should we all be developing competing plumbing when we can go and put that together in something, keep it maintained, and then work on the things around it that expand markets and create new ecosystems and build partnerships and do the things that we all really want to do, which is build a big marketplace for us all to participate in. So
And that's a really interesting way to describe it, because it made me think of a story that a coworker of mine told me a while back when he lived in Japan for a long time. He said that a lot of the houses over there were built by different companies, and each of the companies would install fixtures that were just a little different from each other. The outlets, the doorknobs, the screw sizes, everything was just a little bit different. So there wasn't a lot of standardization. So it made it difficult as someone who was living in the house to go buy a new doorknob or to go buy even the electrical outlets or the light fixture. Everything was just a little off. And it made it hard as a user. And it made it hard as someone that was going to want to come in and fix it, because you had to get that brand to fix it. How do you and I think the foundation model and the way you talked about that sounds like, the way to overcome that, to settle on a standard. What do you see maybe as the next, or how much, or as the next standard to kind of come out, or how does that process work successfully? You gave the example of Kubernetes. I mean, how do companies make the decision to take something maybe that, they were the sponsor on, they were working on, and then to move it out, give up maybe a little control, or to put it out in the community in a way that's going to create that standard that is beneficial to them and everybody? How difficult a conversation is that to have with folks?
So it's actually not that hard to have, but it's good if you get something out there to start with so people can see it. The most important thing to starting the conversation is the code's got to be out there and be visible so that people can look at it. And if you just come to someone and say, well, I got this little thing over here and it really should be open source, don't you want to come work with me? That's not going to work, right? You got to have it's got to be out in the open. You've got to start to see some community participation in it. Maybe it's got quite a few stars that have happened in GitHub, right? So you know that it's both useful and people are using it, et cetera. There's forks that are happening, et cetera, right? That's really important, because now you have at least some level of confidence that this is something that might be significant. We do it all the time. For us right now, trusted AI is really important. If you look at where the world is going, and I look at the types of things that customers are trying to do, they're trying to solve problems with AI now. We've been through the machine learning phase. There's a real appetite to understand how to engage in and build things in AI. And that therefore means that having trusted AI is really important. So, our own example, we put out our AI Fairness 360 toolkit, and we've put that now out into the Linux Foundation's AI group, LFAI, so that we have people around the world now working on tools that help you do good, do things that are ethical, right? Make sure that you're not being sabotaged in some way because someone is spoofing that image, say, that your AI is trying to look at and figure out what to do with, or that you have bias in your models such that you're penalizing one particular group when you really shouldn't be, those types of things. So trusted AI is an example of where we're making sure that things come out in their standards. And I think that's going to be so important. The developers who come to us all the time are looking to solve their problems with AI now, and it's been really, really cool and interesting to see that. Quantum computing, right? We put out a kit on QuizKit so that people could get going in quantum computing and actually play with real hardware and test out algorithms and see what would happen. And hopefully that then becomes the basis for building compilers and other things on top of that technology, right? Because it's in its infancy. But here we can start to build the standards together, because we've seen this whole, how do you make computing work before, right? We know you've got to build compilers and other technologies in order to then enable the masses to be able to use it, right? So there's exciting things going on, and we're putting code out there, and so we decide that, based on this is going to be important to the basis, it needs to be things that are plumbing, that is just good hygiene that we all can work on together, and then put them into a place where they'll be accepted and can be moved on.
Yeah, I love the Qiskit stuff. And I'm a question, building on that, and also going back to something you said earlier, which is talking about people that have passion for projects, and people that want to work on interesting things, and people that want to solve problems. Because that leads me to something I wanted to ask you about, which is, if you're a company and you're looking to attract open source developers or people that would be interested in working on open source projects and open source code that you're working on, what are the best ways to do that from the organization, the foundation, the company's perspective of attracting people? When you're looking for developers, we talked about the skills that you're looking for, but let's say, you're finding people with those skills. How do you make it attractive for them to come in and join your organization?
So, I think the thing that we've seen is you show your commitment to open source, right? We've been at this for 25 plus years. We've got 3,000 plus developers at any given time putting code out there, 15,000 commits a month happening, things like that, right? 1,900 plus repositories opened up on GitHub. So you put that on display. You make sure that folks know that you have a commitment and that you're out working in that space. But then we have, for ourselves, and others do as well too, developer.ibm.com, right? Everybody's got a developer site, developer.ibm.com. But if you go in there, you can find that there's quite a bit of guidance for developers on open source. There's mentors that you can get through working with our advocates. You make sure that people understand that you're in it. You're in it with as much passion as they may be in it, and you show people all the projects that you're out working on and working in, and that it's code, content, and community is how we view the world here. And we put good code examples out there so people can see open source projects being consumed and used, and as part of the technology stacks that allow them to solve problems, right? We tell them, the communities that we're a part of and, participate in, as well as how to participate in those communities. And then we have good content around all of that, so that they can discover and find new information that will help them and guide them. And it's not a marketing site. That's the last thing I think you want to do with developers, is ever market to them. You want to show them and talk to them about good technologies and what they can do with them, and the rest sort of follows, because they're passionate, they're curious, they're interested. They're going to go follow through with that, and eventually they're going to find the other pieces that build on those technologies that are IBM products. But regardless of whether they go the product route or not, they have some trust in us as a partner, and maybe work a little better with us out in open source communities as well too. So. And once you have that trust, people are much more willing to come and join you as an organization. I mean, the folks who come to me and work in my organization love the fact that they get so much freedom in the open source work that they can go and do. And that's really the thing that attracts them the most, quite honestly.
I'd love to wrap up. You mentioned developer.ibm.com. And I'd love to wrap up by hearing about maybe some of the really interesting things that you can talk about, projects that you've got going on there, at open source projects you've got going on at IBM, and where folks might be able to go to learn more about those, if it's different than just developer.ibm.com.
No, it's really developer.ibm.com is the place to go and learn. There's so many projects that we're involved in.
I don't, anything you're excited about, I guess.
One of the things I really like that the team has done recently is Project Elira. It's part of so we have the Center for Open Data and AI Technology. That's also, you'll find under developer as well too. And Elira helps people who are working in Jupyter notebooks to actually manage workflow, because it's a lot of work to both, create, train, test, and go back through this. And so Elira is a project for folks who are working with notebooks that really manages that workflow and helps them go. And people really love that. So I've been really excited about the things that are going on with Elira.
And that's an AI that's an AI centric project, right? And we were talking about AI before.
Yeah, exactly. The QuizKit thing we've already talked about. The adversarial robustness toolkit work, the AI fairness work, the explainability work. You know, the thing that goes on in AI that bugs the hell out of most people is that you get this black box and you can't understand it. So being able to sort of work back through how it's making its decisions so that you can figure out whether that's what you really intended and want to have is something that's pretty neat. So that's one that really I kind of excited about. Homographic, gosh, well, we'll have to edit this part because I got a fully homographic encryption toolkit, right? You know, it doesn't just roll off the tip of your tongue. I argued with the guys when they were putting it out there that they really just needed a cool name, but they didn't do it. You know,
well, that's the engineer, that's the developer, and everybody. You know, we need a name that is descriptive about what this is, and not splashy. But I understand. But you know, you've got to kind of overcome that reluctance to go with a marketing name, something that's catchy.
Well, so just a quick aside. So QuizKit, right? And I probably shouldn't say this one, but I'll do it anyway. We were trying to get a really sexy name, and we said, gee, it should be something like knife, right? And of course, the marketing team were just, you know, oh, can't do that. So if you go look up quiz in Klingon, you'll find that it's a big knife.
I love it. Now that's an amazing insight. That's a little Easter egg hidden in the name. I love that, and it does roll right off the tongue. So it solves for both of those problems.
But anyway, that the encryption toolkit allows you to work on data on the fly. It's staying encrypted, right? And not having to understand, you know, encryption technologies in order to be able to go and do that. And think about, you know, the problem that we have in AI is access to data so often, right? So if you can work on somebody's data encrypted, not be able to see it, share data among people, and then be able to do your training and do it on a much broader pool without someone giving up their crown jewels, but at least, you know, building that better model, that's a wonderful thing, right? And what we've also done is, you know, to help in AI put out our data sets, right? So there's a project underneath us called DAX, which is our data asset exchange process. And that's available soon through Red Hat Marketplace. I guess it's up on Red Hat Marketplace now. So you can actually find it and get it easily and deploy it through a container on OpenShift and be able to go and use it. So those are the things I'm you know, somewhat passionate about, I guess, is making sure that the folks understand that. Really, again, also all around the theme of AI. I think it's just so important right now as we help developers over that hump of going from machine learning to truly exploiting AI.
Well, Todd, it's been a fantastic discussion. I mean, I can't thank you enough for being here and talking open source with us and talking just developer trends in general. Thank you again.
Well, and thank you, Bill. I really appreciate the time. And, you know, this is, again, I'm passionate about this. Maybe you can tell my hands are telling you the story too, right? Right. But it's a great topic and something that, you know, really we need to give people good guidance. So appreciate you doing a series on this too.
And thank you to all our viewers and listeners for joining us. You can listen to more episodes of Dynamic Developer on your favorite podcast platform, or you can watch a video and read a transcript of this episode at TechRepublic.